Turn everything over to Adam Davis, Executive Director of Oregon Humanities.
Thanks Todd, and thanks to the Deschutes Library Foundation for putting this all together. Thanks for showing up on a beautiful day for lunch. I think the goal really is to talk about, it's interesting how prison right now and the correctional system is in many different places in our culture right now showing up as both a question and a problem. Both in pop culture and politically, we're seeing alliances we've never seen before. People from across all sorts of aisles getting together to say we got to do something here. And then just in the daily news, even here yesterday, all sorts of ways that this is a part of our lives. And I think we have a really good opportunity with 3 different people here who know prisons and the correctional system really well and from different entry points. And so what I hope we'll do is spend about 20 minutes with just some priming questions and then invite questions from you to push further and more deeply where you think we ought to be going. So I just want to quickly introduce the folks on the panel whose bios you already have, and you probably know who they are, but I'm going to say a little bit and then just invite them to start talking. So on my right and your left, Marcia Morgan, who has all sorts of history with the correctional system, both as a consultant, a researcher, working in prisons around the country and the world. Piper Kerman, who wrote a book that has become something that doesn't need an introduction at this point, I think. I'm colorblind and I still know about Orange is the New Black. And then Max Williams, who currently is directing the Oregon Community Foundation, but in a previous and possibly related incarnation was directing Oregon's correctional system. So the way I want to get us started is to ask the 3 of you, and maybe we could start with Marcia. I just want to ask how prison or the correctional system or whatever term you feel most comfortable using, how it became something that was a concern for you. So I could put it crassly and say, what brought you to prison? But really, what made it a concern for you?
Well, it's not that jazzy of a story. Can you hear okay? Is that okay? But I did grow up in Salem, and pretty intact family. Went to Disneyland. You know, had a really healthy, happy upbringing. But I always had a curiosity when I started to watch I Spy or The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. or all those shows way back when. That I had a curiosity about what made people tick. So I went to undergraduate school at Oregon State and majored in sociology, criminology, and became a correctional officer at Benton County Jail, Lane County Jail, and then was in law enforcement for 7 years, heading up a sexual assault unit that was all female, which was unusual in 1975. What really got me going was around the sexual assault issue, how many people were affected by that. We wrote a lot of the laws that are in existence now in Oregon, and it just, it was a concern, it was a passion. I was a feminist, I still am, and I think working with women is such an important thing. Because of the correctional and law enforcement kind of connection, when I got into doing some of the prison work, I worked with Department of Corrections, recruiting college faculty to teach, and started doing some consulting. I found that almost all, a high majority of the people, especially women in prison, had been sexually assaulted. So this really was like this full circle with my own career and my own passion. And I can talk more, but I'll pass it over.
Great. Thank you. Piper, how did it become a concern for you?
Well, I don't know if I would have ever been focused on prison or jail if I had not been sent to prison. And in the early 90s, when I was 22 years old, I was involved in a relationship with somebody who was involved in narcotics. And at her request, I carried a bag of money from Chicago to Brussels, and was terrified by the experience, and fortunately had the wherewithal to get myself out of that situation, which many women don't, and many men don't actually as well. Made my way out to California, the West Coast, reconnected with college friends, got my life back on track in many, many ways, got a great job, moved forward, and years passed before the federal government knocked on my door and said, hey, you've been indicted in Chicago. And so that was when it was time to be held accountable for my crime. And when the smoke cleared, I walked into prison almost 11 years after I'd committed that crime. I was very, very fortunate to only serve 13 months of a 15-month sentence. It was stark to me how differently many of the women that I was incarcerated with had been treated by the criminal justice system than my own treatment. You know, I was able to afford, you know, top shelf counsel, to hire a former US attorney as my defense attorney, and the difference in terms of my own experience of incarceration and my own experience of the criminal justice system more broadly in comparison with the majority of people who do end up in the system was very apparent from day one. And so those were some of the things that really drove me to write my book about the experience of incarceration. And of course, the response to the book has been, you know, humbling and gratifying, and the adaptation into a Netflix series is a kind of a very strange twist in the story. But I'm delighted to be here because I am always thrilled when the book offers any opportunity for communities to come around these topics and debate and discuss how we can have a more just and more effective criminal justice system.
Thank you, and I think that's where we'll end up. We'll push in that direction as we keep going. Max, how did this become a concern for you?
Well, first let me say it's great to be back in Bend. This is my hometown where I was born and raised, and it's nice to be here. I came to it in also an interesting and not intentional way. I was practicing law in Portland and ended up running and being elected to the Oregon legislature right around the time Oregon implemented term limits. And because there weren't very many, all the people who knew anything had been kind of kicked out of the legislature, and they didn't have very many lawyers, I quickly ended up as the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives that had the jurisdictional responsibility for overseeing policy related to the Department of Corrections. So I spent a substantial amount of my legislative time in oversight of corrections. And one day I was going home for the weekend and get lots of material, and there was a monograph that had come out from an organization called the Urban Institute called But They All Go Home, written by a researcher by the name of Jeremy Travis. And I took that home and read it over the weekend, and I had this epiphany that in Oregon we had made these decisions about incarceration, and we were funding the expansion of the Oregon Department of Corrections pretty substantially, and we hadn't invested any thinking really on what happens to the returning offender. And this was all about reentry and transition. So I started working on those issues as a legislator. A few sessions later, Governor Kulongoski came to me and said, "We've done a national search, we haven't found anybody we're happy with, and would like you to serve as the director of the Department of Corrections." And I laughed at him and told him no. And he and I are of a different political persuasion, and we got along on a lot of things and disagreed on a lot of things. And he was relatively persistent, and so within a few months after that, I agreed to serve as the corrections director of the state of Oregon, and I served for 8 years. So that's kind of how it came to me.
So given your different entry points and also your deep and different experience with prison or the incarceration, the correctional system, I guess I want to ask the very basic question of what you think prison is for. What does it do? What can it get done? Before we turn into problems with the existing system, what's it for? Maybe we could start with Piper this time, or keep rotating down each time.
I actually would encourage perhaps one of your law enforcement folks, because they'll probably offer an affirmative view, and I might counter that.
You don't want to offer the counter beforehand?
Nope.
All right, sounds good. Max, you want to defer as well?
You know, I would say, and I think there's all sorts of documents and statutes and all of that say what prison is intended for in Oregon. But the reality is, it's, I think, for two purposes. In my mind, primarily for rehabilitation. I mean, that's the primary purpose. 93% of everybody who serves in the Oregon Department of Corrections releases and returns to the community. So if you're not focused on rehabilitation, then you're really not doing much to overall improve community safety when these individuals return. So the first thing is, in my mind, rehabilitation. And the second thing is to apply society's determination about what kind of penalty a person should have for playing outside of the rules that we've established. And there's a lot of room for interpretation about whether we've done that very well, and I'd say in many cases we haven't done it very well. I often say that, you know, we need to think when we think about those issues about, and you hear this a lot in correction circles, finding the distinction between who we're mad at and who we're afraid of. We have done a lot of increasing penalties for people that we're just mad at, as opposed to people that we ultimately need to be afraid of. And there is a purpose for prisons and jails to separate individuals who are dangerous to society from the body politic. That's absolutely sure. But we often use it as a way to express our dissatisfaction with people's choices in a way that doesn't ultimately lead to actually increased public safety and isn't a good use of state resources. So that's sort of but it's rehabilitation, it's separating dangerous people from the broader society. Those are the primary reasons in my mind that we have prisons.
Yeah, I think I would answer the same way as Max did regarding those two levels, but I would also throw out that I'm not sure we are really settled on what our definition is. When you look at corrections historically, William Penn was the first one who kind of came up with this idea in the 17th century that we would have sweatshops. So the women would spin the yarn and the men would work on woodworking kinds of things. And then the Quakers came forward with some social reform and said this is not good to have these sweatshops. People need to do penance. So they set up penitentiaries where they would have silence and reflection time and so forth. And then we got into solitary confinement kinds of trends. And then we got into really we need to do pain and punishment. So we would have hard labor, we'd have chain gangs, we would have withdrawal of food or sleep deprivation kinds of approaches. And then you fast forward to like the 70s where we had a lot of halfway houses in communities and in neighborhoods where people who were sentenced would go to these houses and they'd still be able to work. They'd still keep their job, where when you go to prison you don't. And they would have AA at night or they'd have some kind of a treatment. Well, those kind of went by the wayside, and I'd say the last 15 or 20 years we've been really more back into the punitive. We've got the war on drugs, we've got 3 strikes you're out, mandatory sentencing. All of those things have made our prisons skyrocket. We'll talk more about women offender kinds of issues, what's happened with women. But we aren't really settled, I don't think. But I really do agree with Max that rehabilitation, since almost everyone gets back out, is a primary thing.
Yeah. So I think that, all those things are true in terms of what our expectation is of prisons, right? That prisons will intervene in behaviors that harm the community, whether we're talking about individual victimization or broader harm to the community, and that prisons or the punishment that is associated with prisons will somehow make victims whole. Whether that is true or not, I really leave to victims of crime to address, because I don't feel like I'm the best person to answer that question. But those are sort of, I always think that a prison sentence and the use of prisons is supposed to serve both the practical purpose of, intervening and ending behaviors that are harmful, and also the moral purpose of making victims, people who have been harmed, individuals who have been harmed, whole whenever possible. So that's the ideal, and I think the reality is very much grounded in exceptionally harsh punishment disproportionately for the people in our society who are already most marginalized. And this is the inherent problem with our current criminal justice system. I don't think that's a new development in many ways, though of course the population of our prisons and jails, the size and the scope is very new. Only in my lifetime have we ballooned from 500,000 people in prison in 1980 to roughly 2.3 million today. That said, I think it's incredibly important for people to recognize that prisons and jails have always played a role in controlling populations that are already marginalized. And so I serve on the board of the Women's Prison Association in New York, which has been in existence since 1840, which is actually when women's prisons were sort of first created, because women used to get locked up in prisons with men. So we can all see how that's not a great idea. But when you look at our logbooks, which are these incredible things, the penmanship is unbelievable. You open them up and you pour through them, and what you see is that basically every single name is Irish. Because that's how prisons and jails were useful, or perceived as useful, in New York in the 1840s or the 1860s. And most of those Irish women were sent to prison for things like public drunkenness, prostitution, not for murder, not for assault, not for the most violent crimes that concern us. So now, of course, the population in New York State looks quite different. It's overwhelmingly Black and Latino. And I think another important thing that we must acknowledge in this country is that the criminal justice system was an essential tool for enforcing slavery, when African American people were not just marginalized, but were defined as 3/5 of a person. And the criminal justice system was incredibly important in enforcing Jim Crow laws once slavery was abolished. And so the criminal justice system's role in maintaining those kinds of social hierarchies, particularly racial hierarchies, is something that if we don't contend with it, if we don't work on that aspect, we can never actually get to a system which is just. And our prison populations are always going to continue to show this incredibly dramatic racial disparity and disparity in terms of opportunity. So 80% of people being accused of a crime being too poor to afford a lawyer is a strong signal that the criminal justice system more broadly, and certainly prisons and jails, are used disproportionately on the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society.
Thank you. So a couple of things maybe to note already. One is what sounds like the gap between theoretically what these institutions are for and the way they actually show up. And then the other, I think, is the power of certain statistics that we're just starting to hear. And I think what I'd like to do is keep going towards the aspiration with a system like this and the reality. And maybe one way is just to ask very simply, are there numbers that you think, or general trends that you think it's important for all of us to think about as we get a little deeper? And you started, Piper, to give us some, the ballooning of the population, who makes up a lot of that population. Are there other numbers that you think, or other sort of basic underlying facts that you think we just ought to have in mind before we think a little bit more analytically about it?
Well, I'll share one that I was thinking about as Piper was talking. While rehabilitation is a key, essential purpose of prisons, I think about my own circumstances of running the budget discussions I did for 8 years in a system that, by the way, nobody is very excited about funding. I was sort of typhoid Mary when I went into the legislature, as you might imagine, with the corrections budget, because it's not the thing anybody wants to fund, and it's incredibly expensive. To give you just an assessment, now at the Oregon Community Foundation, it's taken us about 40 years to build an endowment of about $1.7 billion. In the 8 years I was at the Department of Corrections, so 4 biennia, I spent on average $1.4 billion every biennia running the Department of Corrections. So I spent almost 4 times in my 8 years the entire corpus of the Oregon Community Foundation in equivalent dollars. So that gives you a sense of the high cost. If you looked at that budget, one of the things you would find is that right off the top, 10% of that budget, so about $140 million, went to pay the debt service on the prisons that we had built and expanded in that prior 10 years. So 10% off the top just paying the mortgage for the prisons that we've constructed. The total amount of money that I had in my budget in all of corrections, in that $1.4 million, dedicated towards rehabilitative services. It was everything from religious services to education to drug and alcohol treatment. All the things that we would count towards rehabilitation was about 4% of the entire budget. So I spent twice as much on debt service than I did on actually being able to buy and fund the rehabilitative services necessary to really deliver that. And so those are the kind of range of numbers that maybe provide a little bit of context.
Thank you. Marcia?
Oh, I like numbers, so I can reel out a bunch of them. I know nationally, and Max, maybe you can say what it is in Oregon, but it's about $24,000 a year per prisoner to house them. And I had to look before I came how much it costs to go to U of O. And it's about the same. It's for room and board and books and tuition. It's almost $24,000 or around that. So I'm just doing that as a throw out for a comparison. Another number that strikes me, and I think Piper's even mentioned this in her book, is that we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. And the numbers, I think these are the most recent. In the US, it's about 754 people per 100,000. And if you compare that to Germany, it's about 87 people per 100,000. 117 people per 100,000 for Canada. Singapore, that has a lot of rules and regulations, it's 273 people. I mean, we're way out of whack. We're just so off the charts. So why is that? Is it laws? Are we a violent society? I mean, there's so many, I think, cultural factors we need to look at to try to solve this so that we aren't incarcerating as many people.
And I want to get us to turn to those questions in just a minute. I think there's something that's come up a couple times that maybe you want to raise first, and that is, I guess, Piper, in your response to the first question, you said you might not have been interested in this as an issue if it hadn't been for the way things shook out for you. And Max, you talked about being typhoid Mary with this stuff. And in a way, what I want to ask is, for people that aren't directly implicated, why should it matter?
It should matter for all the fiscal reasons that were just outlined in terms of this staggering cost of incarcerating people and the incredibly poor outcomes that we get after spending all that money. You know, generally the recidivism rate in this country, you know, is estimated around 2/3. You know, in other words, so 2/3 of people who come out of prison are going back. And that varies a lot by state. Some states have much better results, and some states have much worse results. You probably know Oregon's numbers, and I don't. So just on a hardcore taxpayer perspective, you know, taxpayers are getting an incredibly poor result for the spending. You know, and that money could be much better spent, as your point about the cost of a college education in Oregon versus incarcerating someone outlines. I have to make the point that folks who end up in the system overwhelmingly have been failed in some way by another public system, and the public school system is perhaps the most obvious, because the minute a kid drops out of high school, their chances of ending up in the criminal justice system skyrocket. You know, and something like 75% of prisoners lack even a high school diploma. And then, you know, to your point about the low budget for rehabilitation, very limited efforts go towards addressing those educational deficits while people are incarcerated. So what's particularly important about that is that, unfortunately, in recent years, policy implementation has reinforced those things rather than address them. So things like, you know, the common language is the school to prison pipeline. And what that means is that when a kid is struggling in school, when a kid is misbehaving, when a kid is failing, when a kid is really having trouble, schools are currently increasingly incentivized to get that kid out of school, to suspend that kid, to expel that kid, to do all kinds of things which really make it likely that that kid's not going to stay in school. This is, again, profoundly counterproductive, because crossing the threshold of a high school diploma, you know, your chances are better at staying out of the system. And even more so, crossing the threshold of higher education and getting higher education. I am an anomaly as a well-educated, college graduate in terms of ending up in the correctional system. Most of the people who do have never had the opportunities that I had.
I'll just give you two numbers since they got raised. Recidivism rate in Oregon when I left corrections 3 years ago, and so I don't know it currently, was about 27%. So we do a pretty good job, and it's been reflected in a number of different works by the Pew Charitable Trust and others that have studied it. Our annual cost is about $30,000 an inmate per year, somewhere in that range. It might be a little higher now since prices have gone up probably since I left. Interestingly enough, to Piper's point, $30,000 a year is also about the same cost it is to have a child in foster care in Oregon, which is interesting. And when I spent time with my friends at the Oregon Youth Authority, the juvenile system, when we would talk about the pipeline, the most interesting and obvious way someone gets to prison in Oregon, if you want to look at just raw statistics, is they first are in the foster care program. Then they end up under the jurisdiction of the Oregon Youth Authority, and then they end up in the Oregon Department of Corrections, and that's the tracking. So when you think about places intervening, and this is maybe a broader conversation that Adam may or may not want us to have, I always looked at the prison system as obviously necessary for the public safety issues that we talked about, but truly symptomatic of, it's more of a symptom of the broader challenges that society is facing. And we have this incredible interest and fascination with crime, and from television programs to, and so we create a society that doesn't, I think, make more criminals. I just think it makes people more scared. And then that fear, I think, drives decisions around policy. And, you know, for a legislator, I can just tell you that if you wanted to make changes in criminal justice policy and sentencing reform, you did it at great political peril for being accused of being soft on crime. So even if it was the right thing to do, every single one of them had in the back of their mind this concern that if they adjust this sentence to something that their opponent in the election will say. And, you know, you can't blame the politicians entirely, because it's us that are electing them. It's us that are making the decisions about who gets elected and driving those decisions. So I think the whole thing is much more societally symptomatic. We didn't end up with the rate of 700 plus per 100,000 accidentally. It is something culturally in this country that drives this behavior. And that's probably for a much deeper sociological conversation. But prisons are not necessarily the problem. They are the symptom of a much deeper problem I think we're dealing with in society.
Sure.
They are a problem, but they're not the problem.
Sure.
I just wanted to respond to the foster care comment, because I think it's really interesting, especially when you look at women offenders, which has skyrocketed statistically much more than men over the last several years. And we can talk about those reasons, but about 80% of all women that are incarcerated are mothers. And the statistics are that about children of incarcerated mothers are 7 to 10 times more likely to go to prison themselves. When a man goes to prison, I think it's around 22% of the children stay with the mother. And about 25% of the kids end up, excuse me, I got that backwards. So when fathers go to prison, 88% of the children then remain with the mothers. So when a woman goes, the children get dispersed many times, and oftentimes do end up in foster care. So when you're locking up women, you're locking up generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, actually, they're 5 times more likely to go into the foster care system when we incarcerate a mother as opposed to a father. And the thing that is incredibly important, to return to your point about this impulse towards punitiveness, is that women are much less likely to commit crimes of violence. They are overwhelmingly likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses and for property crimes. Those are the things that really have driven women's incarceration. So this question of what are we reaping from these, from these decisions and from this incredibly punitive impulse? You know, women have been the fastest growing part of the system for decades now. And they continue to grow, even at a point where many correctional systems, and the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in this country are in state systems. You know, so in many cases, those numbers seem to be flatlining, at least. But women, the rate of incarceration for women continues to rise. Now back to that point of like sort of that rate of incarceration flatlining and like where are we heading as a country? The really good news is that some states have succeeded in making changes. And so New York, New Jersey, you know, a number of other states have decreased their prison populations by very big numbers. I believe New York has reduced the prison population by 27%, with no increase in violent crime. And New Jersey has done the same thing. California is a sort of a complicated story, but they're on track to make really significant inroads. Texas. So some of the biggest punishers have started to do things differently in some ways, and they have really reaped the rewards of that. They've reaped cost savings. They have not experienced the rise in crime, which many times was threatened, right? Like that, if we stop locking so many people up, then crime rates are going to skyrocket. That is not what we've seen. What we've seen, in fact, is that the states that have reduced their correctional populations the most have actually enjoyed the greatest declines in crime. And so that's incredibly important for people, and it's very counterintuitive for many people, so particularly if you're not connected to the system. If you're a member of what is often called the general public, that might seem really counterintuitive, but it's an incredibly important thing to look at. The fact that when you build your correctional systems so big that they start to feed crime rather than addressing it is important.
So I want to make sure we have good time for you to ask questions. So I want to ask a last short question before opening it up, and I hope you'll push on those areas that have just started to open up, whether it's around the differences between what the prison system is like as it deals with men and women, or whether it's the larger question of how prisons are symptomatic of larger cultural problems, which is a point that's hard to argue with and also a little overwhelming in general and in a short amount of time. And so the last thing I want to ask before opening it up is really around where significant change is happening. And I want to ask each of you in a way one or two things that make significant change possible, or the changes themselves, but just to identify either progress or the things that are necessary to make progress in this area. Just short as a way of then transitioning to your question.
Starting with me, okay. I think two things. One is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was passed in 2003, that it's trying to address sexual assault by staff to inmates, inmates to inmates situations. There are standards that they have to comply with, so they're recognizing finally, I think, that about reported 1 out of every 10 inmates or offenders rather, will have a sexual assault happen. So I think that law is really a positive step in the right direction to protect people. So I think also a lot of the women facilities that I've gone to, they're accepting that gender responsive and trauma informed kinds of approaches are making a difference. They're not resisting it like they did even 5 years ago. That we do need to recognize that women have had trauma in their lives. Most of them have had trauma of sexual abuse, witnessing a parent being murdered in front of them, whatever it might be, but mostly around abuse and domestic violence.
Thank you.
I mean, again, if you want to return to how some of those other places have accomplished such significant change, they have passed sentencing reform in substantive ways. So New York significantly revamped the Rockefeller drug laws, which had started sending huge numbers of people to prison for exceptionally long sentences, and those laws have been widely copied all over the country, unfortunately. But New York reformed those laws, and so we began to see far fewer commitments to prison. It's really important to always remember that there's no such thing as prison reform, there's criminal justice reform, because the criminal justice system is truly a system. So when you do something in one area, there's policing, there's courts, there's corrections, there's reentry, which is probation and parole. Everything has a ripple effect. So there were also substantial changes over time in New York around policing. And so one thing that we saw happen in New York is that far fewer people were getting sent to prison from the New York metropolitan area. And that made a big difference in terms of fewer people in the state correctional system over time. And New York has done a good job at beginning diversion. And so there are a lot of innovative courts like drug courts, veterans courts, mental health courts, which work to try to divert people out of the system who are simply not going to benefit from incarceration and who need significantly different interventions to get their behavior to change rather than a cage.
I guess I'd sum up by saying there is a growing, and certainly I experienced it both legislatively and then while I was running the system, a growing acceptance of evidence being part of the conversation to drive policy. And for a long time, there just wasn't, nobody was doing the math, nobody was thinking about the numbers, nobody was really using evidence as a means of trying to identify consequences. So in two specific things where I think it's made a difference, I think some of the evidence has been successful in getting people to think differently about how offenders who are releasing to the community release with better plans, better resources, more coordination, more collaboration, because you can track the numbers, as Piper said, and see the real expense that happens both in, for the system, but also for the individual and the community is public safety if you don't invest in those kind of reentry services. And so I think people are starting to be persuaded by the evidence, and by people I mean policymakers, decision makers, but I also think the public generally is starting to wake up to this issue in a way that they haven't previously, or more interested in that. The second one is just the evidence associated with the fiscal costs. I think the more we're able to put a fine point on the expense of, again, Piper used the phrase, people who aren't well benefited by incarceration. There are a number of people who end up in prison, and mental health is probably the #1 issue for me. I had a huge problem with burgeoning populations, particularly in the women's side. More than 50% of all of the women that were serving at the Coffee Creek facility, our women's facility, had severe and acute mental illness issues that required prescriptions, interventions, actual treatment, group therapy. I mean, not just somebody who's feeling a little blue or suffering minor depression. I mean, serious mental health issues. So understanding the fine point on that cost and being able to then articulate how prisons are not a conducive environment for someone with mental illness to actually become better is something that it's happening. But we are woefully slow, I think, in this country to try to address those issues. But it's progress, I think. And I don't know if Marcia agrees, but I think the evidence in the last 15 years is starting to move conversations in a way that certainly wasn't previously.
Yeah, the evidence-based practices is the buzzword.
So I feel like there's so much to absorb and think about already, but what I'd like to do is open it for areas that you want to go deeper into. So if you have a question, can you signal us in some way that's not too aggressive, and we'll try to get you. Can we start here with me?
Well, I have lots of questions I'd like to ask, but I'll just start with Piper. You've mentioned, and same with UMax, about reform and how that's sort of starting to gain some traction. And I guess in most things that are sort of deeply rooted as institutions and the way people think, it seems like there's a tipping point that causes change, that either we can't afford it anymore, or maybe there's a body of evidence that comes back, or what have you. And in New York, obviously, there was some sort of a tipping point for people to get the courage to tackle some of that change. So I was curious what happened there, and then what maybe we can look forward to in Oregon to get to a point where we're investing more in our students than we are in our prisons.
I think it's always a calculus. I think actually it would be hard to ever boil something down to one thing. Advocates have been working long and hard, over long periods of time on those drug sentencing laws, which were so misguided. And I'm sure the political situation just lined up at that time. I believe, we had a Democrat as a governor at the time that those reforms were signed into law. But it is a calculus, and it's not always sort of a finely, marionetted thing, because, for example, in New York, the policing strategies that were in place in New York City are controversial, right? They're controversial in terms of what they were doing. So it's not always a perfect equation of like, oh, we have a reform strategy and we're going to set all the wheels in motion and it's going to go just the way we expect it to. But I think one of the things that overwhelmingly helped, frankly, in a terrible, heartbreaking way, was when the economy went bust in 2008 and state governments were just like, we can't do the things that government is expected to do when we spend so much money putting people in prison. So I actually think, if I had to point to one single thing that really has made a big difference in recent years, certainly when you look at the 17 states that have moved legislative reform through their bodies, in recent years. Some of those reforms were pretty conservative or tentative. Almost all of them got passed with significant effort from the Republican Party, because it's very hard for Democrats to move this, whether because of they lack courage of conviction or because they are too much at risk of being accused of assault and crime in a way that Republicans are not. But
But overwhelmingly, when we look at those 17 reform packages that have passed, and it might be 18 because Alabama just passed one, Republicans have a lot to do with that.
I just say one of the barriers in Oregon is much of our sentencing policy. We didn't make the mistake that New York and Texas and some of these states made with respect to drug sentencing. We didn't pass overarching, really punitive drug sentences. We did pass mandatory sentencing for person crimes. And then we passed some follow-up property crime sentencing that had some mandate type things in it. The challenge is our person crime law, we passed through the initiative process. And so the initiative, two things. One, it required these sentences and was passed by the people. Two, it was called Measure 11. What we sometimes forget is we also passed Measure 10 simultaneously, which said that the legislature can't change any sentencing law approved by the public through the initiative process without the legislature having a supermajority. So we supermajoritized any adjustments to the law. So you don't just need 31 votes in the House and 16 votes in the Senate and an agreeable governor. You got to have 2/3 majorities in both houses. And as you know, Oregon politics, the margins in our chambers have been narrow quite a bit over the last 15 to 20 years. So courage of conviction is not something that's been strong on anybody's agenda to form the kind of coalition. Now there have been reforms, and some of them are showing effect, and we've done some important work on justice reinvestment in Oregon that is, I think, having a progress and is lowering the prison population, and they're making some really good progress. But we haven't had the broad sort of kind of reforms that you've seen in some of these other states, in part because we involved the body politic in making these laws, and ultimately we're going to have to involve them in changing them if we want to see change.
I'm going to invite, there was a hand over here.
Yeah, the Oregon's recidivism rate being 27% strikes me as fairly low. I mean, of course we could do better. So Max, I'm wondering if you could describe why that is, especially given the 4% budget that you had for rehabilitation during your time.
A couple of issues. One is I'm always hesitant to compare recidivism rates a lot because there are lots of different numbers that go into it. But in ours, it means conviction of a new felony within 3 years of release. That's the measure, right? So that's a fairly standard measure, but that's the one that Oregon uses. Primarily, the difference is we have a community corrections system that supervises released offenders, typically for about 3 years, depending on the offense, when they release out, and we don't revoke people back into prison. So when someone gets out of prison in Oregon and they are under community supervision and they make a mistake, they screw up, they blow something, their parole officer doesn't just put them on a bus and send them back to the state system. They may do a limited sanction in the local county jail. So there are these community corrections beds identified in the local jail. So they may go in and do a 30-day penalty or a 60-day penalty or a 90-day penalty based on what they've done as a sanction that the parole officer can employ. And so a lot of systems, California being a great example, if you're out in the system and you're released from a California prison and 2 days later you do something, your parole officer says you violated the terms of your supervision, you're back on a bus and you're in a new reentry center in the California Department of Corrections as an intake inmate. And Oregon doesn't have that. And it was a really good strategy. About 1997 is when we did it. And it's allowed us to manage offenders in the community during that period of time in which they're under supervision at a lower cost. You know, the counties would sometimes argue with me, and Andy probably knows that, but at a lower cost and with less churn, less people coming right back in the door 60 days after they're getting out. And that's one of the reasons that our recidivism rate has stayed lower than other states.
Yeah. And just to comment on the kinds of things that often prompt parole revocations, it's, you know, testing, you know, failing a drug test or failing to show up for an appointment with your parole officer or your probation officer. It's not necessarily the commission of a new offense. So, you know, places like, you know, New York was doing the same thing and made changes around parole revocation and sending people back to prison. And California is obviously really egregious in terms of doing that and has, you know, suffered as a result.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, Piper, I'm so excited that you're here. I work I actually work at the Deer Ridge Correctional Facility, which is a men's facility just 50 miles north of here. And the program I do is an entrepreneurship program for the prisoners. And it strikes me how so many of them are young men in their 20s. And I was just saying to Kim before that it's really, I really work on myself not to be motherly to them, because I feel like, oh my gosh, they've been in here for 6 or 7 years, and what do they know of the outside world? I want to tell them everything that's going on, but I try not to, because we have to stick to the curriculum and do what we're supposed to. But what really strikes me is when these young men are ready to, and middle-aged and older men, when they're ready to leave, they must go back to the place where they offended. So many of them don't have family there, they have no means of support, and it just seems so unfair to throw them out there. I mean, I know they have a parole officer. I am only able to keep in touch with the ones that released to Deschutes County. So I follow up with them. I had a young man who was staying at the Shepherd's House, was trying to start his own business, at least to subsidize while he was working. No car, no means of transportation. And in Bend, that's an issue. You know, our public transportation is not that great. And I'm just wondering if there isn't something that we can do to give them a little more support when they do release. So it reminds me of that young woman in your story. She gets out, she goes to her family in New York, and she ends up sleeping on some lice-infested mattress, and she decides it's better for her to go back. It's actually a better life for her. So, you know, I just wonder if there's any means to, you know, have that be more important.
There are lots of reentry efforts, some stronger than others depending on the counties you're in. I point everybody, if you want to see a really great model reentry program, Eugene has a program called Sponsors that is probably one of the strongest reentry programs that I've seen in the state. Really great. But you've defined the very problem that many of them have. They come out without a job, they're wearing the felony label on their forehead, so people aren't going to rent to them in many cases, particularly when rental rates are so tight in so many communities. They're going to have difficulty finding employment. And if you look at what their packet says, those are the things they're supposed to do, right? Find a safe place to live, by the way, not with any other offenders. Also get a job, and then start doing all these other things on the list. And we create incredible barriers for people to be successful when they come out. So there's a lot of work being done in this area. It's a lot of nonprofits that are involved. The state systems are involved. Your county parole and probation office is involved. But again, we can put all the systems in place, but if people's hearts and minds aren't changing about giving these people that second chance, it isn't going to go very far. So a lot of this message is about changing people's hearts and minds about, you know, they paid their debt to society, right? So, but we don't really believe that. We say that, but we don't really believe that, because we won't rent an apartment to them. We won't give them a job. And then pretty soon, the only place they can go is back to the group of people who are always willing to take them back, which is the friends that and associates they probably had before they got into trouble in the first place.
This really drives home the point around harsh sentencing as well, because the longer you're incarcerated, the more tenuous your ties are back to the community, back to your family, back to your friends, but back to anybody who has a stake in your success coming home. And I think it's hard for folks who have never been incarcerated or don't have significant experience with the system to really comprehend just how harsh a 10-year sentence is. You know, it's an exceptionally harsh sentence. And removing somebody from the community for 10 years really creates this tremendous mountain for folks to climb. I always sort of feel like much beyond 5 years, a sentence has a real diminishing lack of return, if you will. I teach now in a medium security men's prison in Ohio, and my guys are serving a wide range of sentences. 3 of them are doing life, some of them are doing much shorter sentences. The thing that is so important, I would say anecdotally, but I think the data supports it, is that when you have, first and foremost, a family, or another network of people who are able to receive you upon your release, that makes all the difference in the world. But again, when we see the connection to the foster care system, And you know, my students just read a book called A Piece of Cake by Cupcake Brown, who is a woman who survived the California foster care system, and frankly, it's a miracle she didn't end up in prison. She did go through the juvenile system occasionally. It's just incredibly, incredibly important that in those instances, frankly, the community has a clear responsibility to stand in the role that for many people a family might fulfill.
I just want to follow that real quick, since I heard at the beginning Maureen's question, the phrase, what can we do? I think that's the way you put it, and I feel like I wonder, especially for people that are a little further removed from this issue. And so, I think Max, you started talking about changing hearts and minds, and now Piper, you're talking about the community taking on more responsibility. I guess concretely, what does that look like? What can we do, especially if we don't already have a stake in this, or knowledge of how to navigate some of the finer stuff you've been talking about?
I'll start really quickly and then I'll pass it along. I think I always tell every group that I talk to that the ultimate thing that you can do is prevent someone from going into the system. So that goes back to this question of the school to prison pipeline and sort of the policies that govern our public education system or our foster care system, mentorship of young people who are at risk. Anything to avoid, you know, somebody getting locked up in the first place is huge. And supporting, you know, interventions that take into account mental illness and substance abuse in the community would also be huge in terms of getting great swaths of people out of prisons and jails who don't belong there. So that front end piece is really, really important. And you know, that includes changing the minds of prosecutors and judges in your community, or changing the prosecutors and the judges in some cases.
I'm also encouraged by the fact that there is more health care available for low-income people. I think that might help to prevent the people that need some mental health care from ending up incarcerated.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
On that stuff again, Marcia, what do you think?
Sure, I always have like 6 things I think are really helpful to do. I like these numbers again. The first, yeah, like Piper was saying, is education. Just do everything you can. Vote for, excuse me, for bonds, for you know, school bonds, help to be a mentor, you know, anything, big brother, big sister, anything like that. I put that all under kind of education as well to help kids stay in school. And I also kind of put things like the Kids Center under that, even though it's not maybe education. But you know, those are kids who have been sexually abused. Not saying they're going to go on to prison, but they have a lot more hurdles and barriers if they aren't given the skills and the support to address some of their issues too. The second is economic jobs. You know, people need to get out of poverty. It affects women more than it does men. My women's thing again, but even as like going to jail, men almost always are able to bail out. Someone comes to rescue them, but statistically women are not able to get that. No one comes in to rescue them and they don't have the money. So they're serving more time in jail because of simple economic things like that. The third is to start with girls, to help girls, this is kind of going the track of female offenders, but it could apply to boys as well, but to really help them understand their own worth, their own self-efficacy, you know, that they can make decisions around bad relationships, what's a healthy relationship look like, and so forth. The fourth is to vote smartly. As we've talked a lot about, you know, or do we automatically say, oh yeah, mandatory sentence, that sounds good. We need to really look and talk to the experts or people in the field about their thoughts around that. And then the fourth, which maybe, or fifth rather, maybe somewhat controversial, is contraception. So many women who have many babies and have put them maybe more into economic poverty, they don't know much about their bodies. They really don't have access to birth control and things like that. So contraception is really a big piece of helping women control their own lives. And then the sixth, I think we already alluded to, is culture. What are we doing in our society around violence, and should we be building more prisons, or are there other ways of addressing addiction and things that, you know, are not, and mental health issues that aren't particularly being addressed well in the prison system now?
I often say that it's very tough to bend the curve at the back end. So one of the great things about being part of the Oregon Community Foundation is the deep investments we make in early childhood and in parenting and in trying to get in front of these issues at the front end. It's one of the reasons that I was so desperate to want this job, is having had the worst job in Oregon, I never had the best job in Oregon. Trying to make these changes on the front end of the system. So front end work is always great, but if you were inspired to actually do the hard work of working with releasing offenders, which it takes a certain kind of person who wants to really step into this space and do it, and that's often why people don't. There are nonprofits all over this region who are doing that kind of work. And if you want to know more about those, there are organizations, not the least of which is our friends at the Oregon Community Foundation here in the Bend office, who can connect you with nonprofits in the region that are doing work directly with these offenders, mentoring programs, education programs out at Deer Ridge, working with your, even programs that are operating here in your Deschutes County jail. So if you really feel inspired to really help people who are on the down and outs, that's the way to do it. Otherwise, invest all your money on the front end.
One more question fittingly from Todd, I guess, yeah.
I just want to say a few years ago I saw Matt speak at the City Club, and you said some things that really sparked all the work we do at the library. We do story times, and it really hit home that we could have a bigger impact with the library. It's one of the reasons we got Oregon Community Foundation to support our early learning spaces. We've been working with the state of Oregon to do an early literacy hub for the three-county area. And it's really inspired us to think about how can we be part of that positive part of the curve. So I want to thank you for that. I think that's just being able to get out and talk about those things is really starting to make a difference.
Any other question here at the end before we
What
look
is our
forward to
prison
this?
population, maybe we could, in Oregon, do you know?
State population, when I left, and I think it stayed fairly steady, it may have grown a bit, is somewhere around probably 14,300 or something like that. So about 14,000 inmates. I'm pretty close, I suspect.
So I think good news is we have more to think about even this evening, and more to hear from Piper in particular. Max said a moment ago that people that work directly on this, it takes a certain kind of person. And I just want to say a big thanks to these three folks for giving so much work to a large, complicated problem that really affects all of us in all sorts of ways. So just maybe please join me in saying a big thanks. Thank again the library for hosting and for working so hard on the front end in lots of ways, and I think we'll formally call this good. Thanks for lunch. I hope you continue talking and thinking about this stuff, and maybe we'll see you later today.